Hello, welcome to the damn podcast. This is your host Pepin, and I have,
Patrick.
and here we're going to talk about something amazing, something intriguing, something. It's been a while. I mean, I haven't seen you like in person for a while, and you're sporting a sexy mask.
Yep. So in my spare time, I decided to become a ninja.
Ooh,
Recently got laid off, so I have time for things like that.
yeah, yep. Are you also doing the whole like baton twirling and everything?
Oh, the whole nine, man. Learning how to use throwing stars, everything.
Nice, nice. Well, I have been working, unfortunately, so I'm a little bit jealous of you. I'm slightly jealous, but it's definitely good to have like a face-to-face conversation because we did some remote ones and those were all right. But it's always hard to get that actual kind of say full connection, full say I don't know. It's a lot easier to interrupt people in person. Like,
Yeah, 100%. There's always that little bit of lag time when we're doing it remotely. So I'm glad to be here too, even with wearing the mask.
Yeah, yeah. I have a bad habit of like when I get onto like a point, I just like don't shut up about it and just keep going and going and going and going. And sometimes it's easy to say like, "Hey, Nate, shut up, shut up."
Like right now, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, man with a mask will call me out on that. So the topic today, I kind of forget what it was because we talked about this beforehand, but something you brought up, which is
Oh,
something intriguing.
yeah. So as you all know, our podcast, does anything matter, right? So we talk here about different philosophical ideas in life and whether or not there's any actual significance to us. Okay. And so a pretty good one to think about is reality itself, right? So the question would be, does reality matter? Or is it just what we see or how we look at it?
So a big part of this, I think, comes back to I have a couple of different people, but I think Descartes is one of the big ones, right? Because he had this idea of uh, the Placid demon. No, it's some sort of demon, right? The Cartesian demon. That's right. Because there's the idea is that imagine you're going about your life, but then there's this demon who's just kind of arranging all the strings behind the scenes. So everything that happens, you think it's happening because of, say, reality, nature, X, Y, and Z, but it's actually this demon is just kind of controlling all the strings and causing everything to happen in your life. And this is, how do you know that you are anything? How do you know you're not just like this manipulation of like a puppet, like the thing that's being controlled from the outside? And so how Descartes kind of got out of this was, I think, therefore I am. So essentially I know, even if I'm being manipulated by the outside, say, world, or by this Cartesian demon, or by these other things, even if my brain is a vat in a jar, or I'm in some sort of matrix, that's all okay because at least I know I'm real myself. So that's kind of like the fundamental, basis that you can kind of expand upon. I think, therefore, I am. I am at least a fundamental point of existence. Whether things exist beyond me is another question. But that's kind of the fundamental point. Is that something you agree with, or?
Yeah, that's such a perfect way to kind of kick this off because you're right. A lot of things leading up to and, after Descartes, really based around I think, therefore I am, right? And anytime that you're talking about a sort of faith-based system or anything that relies upon the concepts of fate or destiny, they always have some type of implication that what we're doing or the reality that we're seeing is either predetermined or interconnected to everything around us. And that may or may not be true, but we wouldn't really have any way of knowing, right? So the core question that we have to ask ourselves, and this was the question that Descartes was trying to answer, was, does any of that interconnectivity matter, or is it just what we individually perceive that makes up our existence?
Right. So the perception is a big portion of that, but that's where I go a little bit confused as well because, I mean, let's take for instance someone who is having a trip on mushrooms or LSD. They're seeing things that don't actually exist in reality. Are those things real, or are those things actually like it's real to that person, obviously? But what constitutes that actual kind of aspect of realness?
Well, but see, that's exactly it though, is we're not curious as to whether reality exists, right? But we're trying to determine whether reality matters. And so it might not be reality. Somebody that's on mushrooms might be seeing things that don't exist scientifically or even theoretically, but the things exist in their perception, and so their experience of that moment is based on what they're perceiving.
So in a way, I mean, it's not that perception's reality. It's more that from a pragmatic point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's a Cartesian demon pulling his strings or if it's, just actually happening in reality or if it's drug trip or anything like that. It's more just like the pragmatism of this is what the experience is and how you deal with that experience is what matters.
Yeah, so like have you ever heard somebody say the expression that perception is sometimes greater than reality?
Kind of, but more in terms of like say frou-frou people.
I've heard uh, I heard this professionally a few times. Like I had a mentor back in the day, a manager that used to tell me that like a good portion of leadership has to do with this relationship between perception and reality,
Hmm.
because people don't people are emotional beings, right? Human beings, what makes us special is that we're emotional, right? And so emotions are not rational. So if you think about it, if you try to apply logic and rationality to an emotional situation, it doesn't often work, right? This is why this is why we get into trouble with our wives, right? Or am I just speaking for myself there?
Well, thankfully, I don't have a wife, so this is oh okay.
Well, okay. Anyway, I'm just saying, like, let's say that you have an employee that's in a situation, they're really heated about something, and you try to explain to them the logical reason why they shouldn't be upset. That's probably not going to matter to them, even if what you're saying is right,
Hmm.
okay? A person might feel justified, even though they're wrong. Their perception of the situation matters more to the persuasion aspect of the conversation than reality.
I don't know, because I think that part of the perception intertwines with reality, right? So if someone is acting in a way which is, say, not incumbent to the facts, what part of your job is, let's say, as someone who's trying to convince them otherwise, is to show them the facts of reality and, give them reason to change their perception about reality. So, for instance, this is a bad example, but let's say that you have this. Let's say you're sitting in the back of a bus, right? And this girl keeps like moving her head, and then every time she moves her head, like her hair whips you in the face, right? And your perception of that, if you have a certain frame of mind, might be that this girl's a jerk. She keeps hitting you in the hair, hitting you in the face with her hair. She's like just this giant big asshole, right? But someone might bring it to their attention, say, "Hey, lady, you're hitting this guy in the face with your hair." She's like, "I am? I didn't realize that." And then the fact that she wasn't aware of that is now brought into view, and that changes the perception of the entire event. So I think there is times where you can say bring in facts of reality or facts of things that may have not been aware or simply just not expanded upon or thought upon, and that can change the perception there.
Okay, you're right. Perception can change, but it still doesn't answer it actually, in a way, reinforces the point, which is that the perception is more important because she didn't change her mind because of the facts. She changed her mind because of the perception. Because when she was whipping the guy with her hair unknowingly, it no, she didn't change the behavior because she didn't know it was affecting somebody else, right? But the third person coming in and saying, "Hey, you're whipping." My perception is that person is annoyed with you, right? You're whipping that person with your
Uh-huh.
hair, right? So yeah, she changed her perception. Like I'm being annoying, right?
Uh-huh.
So because of that perception, now she's like, maybe I should stop doing that. Is it the fact or is it the perception? Because let's say that person wanted to be whipped with her hair or enjoyed it for some reason and nobody called it to her attention. Would she have changed the behavior? I don't know if it's the action or if it's the fact that somebody is telling her that, and in telling her that, it gives her the perception that she's being a nuisance.
Well, it's the perception, but it's also the fact of that's considered in that perception. Because it's like that the way I kind of see it is that each person is like an island unto themselves, or there's a shared space, and that shared space is reality, which is governed by the laws of physics. And of course, we're not like separate from that entirely because we're made of atoms, and atoms are made from reality. But like sense wise and kind of decision making wise, like we have like a bridge to the reality, but that bridge does not necessarily have to be in complete congruence because all we're doing is just like taking in photons into our eyes, we're taking in sound waves, and we're kind of deconstructing them and kind of reconstructing them into this internal model. So there's how reality actually is on the outside, but then there's also, our reconstruction of that reality or our kind of projection. Like we're just kind of estimating, right? And that estimation can be accurate or it can be inaccurate. And the idea here is that this person was not aware of certain aspect of reality because we don't have full knowledge. We have the knowledge that we take in through our senses. And that she also has some certain sense of ethics, right? She doesn't want to be smacking people in the face with her hair for no reason. So when she gets brought to her attention that there's this thing happening in reality that she wasn't aware of, now she's aware of it because it seems logical. If this guy was like on the other side of the bus and she was told that she was whacking him with the hair, she'd be like, no, my hair's not that long. It's not physically possible. But if the guy's like right there and her hair's right there, she's like, oh, that seems likely. She can make a judgment call there. She can take the fact or the likely fact, reported fact to her that she's doing that or that's probably happened. And she could say, okay, now I need to change my behavior in order to, say, remedy this because I have my own internal moral convictions and I want my internal reality, my internal perceptions to have a high correlation with the external reality.
Okay, but that's a pretty specific example, and so it's pretty easy to apply those principles there. But let me give you one that's a little bit more complicated and see if we can apply the same logic to it. So let's say you have a situation where you are in a position of leadership, and we'll just say that it's a restaurant because, again, this is where I first heard the expression, perception is greater than reality. And this is the kind of situation that it would be applied to when I was told this. If you're in a position of leadership, and let's say that you take a shortcut, okay? Like you're supposed to make marinara sauce in a steam kettle, and it's supposed to be simmered for 8 hours to maximize flavor and all this, right? But you don't have any sauce, and you have to make it on the fly because you don't want to compromise the guest experience. So you make it in a saute pan. You take all the ingredients and you throw it into a saute pan and you make it quickly, right? So the perception is that you're taking a shortcut. And so there might be people that look at that and say that it's okay to do that, right? And as a leader, you're supposed to lead by example. So the next time that somebody does it that way and you have to correct them and say, that's not the right way to do it, then their perception is that you're a hypocrite. So that undermines your leadership, right? So what do you do in a situation like that? Like where you know that you would have to compromise your standards to not do it correctly. Right? You don't think that people's perception of your actions matters?
Right, but the perception of their actions are incumbent in reality as well, right? So there's not like a disconnect there. It's just kind of more complex method, especially given that it's like this is where high level concepts gets really confusing because let's say that the high level concept is integrity, all right, or let's say due diligence or say justice, right? Those are super high level concepts and they're kind of more hard to measure, right? Like it's easy to say that this thing is rectangular or this thing is spherical. It's harder to say that this person is virtuous, that this person is a good person. And so those perceptions are harder to, number one, measure and determine, but also they're harder to kind of affect because they're more inherently fuzzy. So like I don't disagree it's a kind of harder situation, but it's not harder because there's a disconnect from reality. It's just this that the number of factors that you have to measure perceptually in order to make that determination is kind of oblique and kind of confusing.
Yeah, but it actually is sort of impossible to lock down some finite information about concepts like justice or virtue. And so that's when I think it does become more important what people's perception of those concepts are. Because let's say that, I mean, being a restaurant manager is one thing, but let's say that you're the president of the United States and you have to make a decision about national security, right? Don't you, in that situation, you want people to feel safe. And objective information it might make some people feel safe, but I think that for most people, it's more important that they know that the president is taking actions to protect them. So they don't need to know what the specific actions are. In a lot of cases, they can't know
Hmm.
because that kind of stuff is classified. But it's not the objective information of what actions that people are concerned about. It is seeing that the leader comes up and says that you are safe here, that we're doing everything that we can do to protect you, right? And it's like the existence of the military is security,
Hmm.
right? We don't, a lot of us don't know what the military is really doing, on a day to day basis, but we feel safer having them around. At least most people do. It's kind of the same thing with police. I mean, recently there's been some debate about that, but it's just the symbology,
Hmm.
that perception is what creates the sense among the community.
Right, right. So there's nothing I disagree about that, but I'm also just like it's kind of saying that there is two different things happening here. Like there's like the meta goal, which is, or there's the actual goal and the meta goal, right? There's like I'm trying to come up with a good example here, but this is an instance of like say a company leader or some just a leader in general trying to say work on a problem. Let's say with this pandemic, let's say. So some people might just want to see that they're working on the problem and trying to resolve it. Like that's what it's important to them is not the details like you're saying, but the perception that something is being done. And that's kind of a lot of things as well. Like a lot of these, say, charity type things, like breast cancer awareness and everything. I mean, there's some argument to say that maybe they aren't super effective, but they do bring awareness, and that awareness makes people feel good because that's the perception aspect being kind of like people are talking about this issue. This is what we want to see, and that makes them feel like the issue's being worked on. Although walking for there is money and everything, but maybe it's not necessarily directly correlated there, right? Just
Yeah.
the raising of awareness.
Yeah, and just expanding a little bit on the concept of people seeing that things are being done, that could be said for like a disciplinary sense too. Like if people sense injustice, their perception is that there's some degree of inequity or injustice.
Mhm.
They want to know that something's being done to correct that. So sometimes what you see is you get a lot of sort of dissonance and discontent within organizations because disciplinary action tends to happen behind closed doors for obvious reasons. But you might get this perception among the troops that the higher ups don't care, or that people are getting away with things and action isn't being taken. The action might be being taken behind closed doors, but there's progressive discipline, and there are steps that companies take to do these things, and they're not all public.
Right. The one thing I'm struggling with here is like I think you can say that's true, but also that it doesn't mean that reality doesn't matter, right? Because you could say that people have this end goal, and some people it matters more that someone's working on the problem than not. Obviously, if no one's working on the problem, that just might be an issue in general. Regardless of the solution, right? So, like, say issues with poverty, right? So people want there to be some sort of working on the problem of poverty. Now, just as a hypothetical here, let's say that the implementation of trying to work on poverty is actually worse than the actual, just leaving it alone, right? I mean, it's like the road to hell was paved with good intentions. There's
Mm-hmm.
going to be ways that you could probably improve property, but there's going to be plenty of things you can do which can also make it worse by, with your ingenious solutions there. Like, I don't know, like maybe your solution is to have this program where you have people buy these scratch tickets to raise a little bit of money, and then some people make millions and blah blah blah. You could encourage bad behavior. That's a terrible example, but you can go about it the completely wrong way. And some people might say, well, at least they're trying something, right? At least they're trying to fix this issue, but maybe the actuality of that it being issue being fixed is not good. So you kind of have two different things there. Now, some people might be fine with the proposed solutions, even if they're not working, because that at least something's being done about it. But other people have another care, is whether it's actually affecting reality in the way that they're saying, whether there's actually alignment there, and those two can't be unlinked. But I think they're two separate things. Like it doesn't mean that perception doesn't matter, or it doesn't that it does, obviously it does matter. It matters in all this, but it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just like some people have more of a weight of something being done, more of a weight of a perception of something being done about it, as opposed to some people have more of a weight on the actuality of what is being done.
Okay, I suppose I could see that. I would just expand a little bit on what I was saying and give you this example. Like, let's say that you want to get a certain point across to your team. Okay, that there's a certain behavior that's unacceptable. You could write somebody up for it. Maybe that's done that behavior, but there's a risk of two things there. The first thing might be that because you're doing that behind closed doors, that you're only talking to that one individual. Maybe you say it to the group, but if you were to, like, say you say it to the group and you only write one person up, the perception is that person is going to feel singled out, right? Because it's likely that other people have done that activity. That person is then going to sow uh, sort of discord among other people because they're feeling disengaged because they feel like maybe they were written up for something everybody's doing. And these are all things I've heard many times in my professional career. I'm not saying everyone does it, but this is something that happens. And then conversely, let's say that the group perceives that you're not holding people accountable, that you're saying something as a standard, but they don't see anybody getting written up or any discipline happening, so they think there's no weight behind what you're saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and this is why I think sometimes the Army gets it right, because one thing that they do in the Army is if one person in the group messes up, everybody has to do some type of punishment, everybody in the unit. Now, I'm not saying that I generally agree with group discipline or group reward, but I'm just saying that in the argument of perception versus reality, this is sort of a relevant discussion because that creates equal perception among the entire group, right? And they know that they're going to be held accountable. And they know that each individual is accountable for their performance as well. I mean, what do you think about that?
So I think I need to like zone in a bit more on the question there, because it's like because I'm in agreement that the perception does matter, and that a lot of times you're not so much managing the reality. I mean, you want to manage the reality, of course, but you're also managing the person's emotions, right, and how they feel and what they see, right. But I don't know how that, say, has like this, like to me that's synergistic with reality, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're kind of working together, they're in congruence, right? And you ideally want the person's perception to be incongruous with reality, unless you're trying to deceive them, of course. But if you're trying to, let's say, create something positive, typically you want them to be synergistic. And you also want to put in, say, a social system or some sort of system that's going to give you the results you want. So in the case of the Army example, where one person messes up, everyone gets punished. You're trying to get this kind of like, we're all in it together. We're kind of a team. And, if you fuck up, if you mess up, everyone else is going to get messed up too, right? That's kind of how it works in battle, right? If one person
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do their job, everyone else is on the line. I mean, it's kind of symbolic in a way, but it's also kind of, real. So, but I don't think there's like a disconnect there. I think you're just managing the perception as a way to also manage the reality.
It could be. You're right. It could be that they end up in perfect congruence. But then philosophically, that still begs the question, right? Does reality matter? Because if the ideal situation is congruence between perception and reality, where people perceive that let's say that reality is they're being treated fairly, and their perception is that they're being treated fairly, then it doesn't only one or the other matter, because why do you need both? If they're in perfect congruence, then couldn't perception alone be significant? Because then whether reality is fairness or unfairness, they think it's fair, and so therefore they're happy, or at least a reasonable person would be happy with feeling like things are fair, right? So let me put it this way. In the situation where we focus on reality, there's two outcomes: fairness and unfairness.
Hmm.
Fairness generates happiness. Unfairness generates non-happiness, right? Let's just say that's true for most rational people. So by focusing on reality, you you want the outcome of fairness. But then in the situation of perception, I mean technically you have the same choice, except that reality doesn't matter because perception overrides reality. Right? Reality doesn't override perception. That's where I'm going with this. Is if you start from a perspective of reality and reality becomes unfairness, perception of fairness can override that. But in the reverse, if you have perception of unfairness, no reality overrides that. Does that make sense?
Not exactly to me. I mean, I'm a little bit lost with this one. One thing that's gonna lose me a little bit is so this is where it gets confusing with higher concepts too, because fairness, unfairness. You can give instances of fairness or unfairness, right? So you can give examples, but they're high level concepts. There's not one particular thing which is unfair. It's a collection of many different things. Like you could talk about someone's getting money when they shouldn't have, one person getting off on something. There's many different disparate examples of unfairness, but there's nothing in reality that's unfairness. It's a high level concept. Like you can point to something that's rectangular and that's, or say, a cube, and that's something which has some sort of tangible reality to it, right? But something which is, say, unfair, there's no like tangible reality to it, and so there's a huge like that thing doesn't exist without the perception, right? But the perception is linked to something in reality, right? Because you can't have, I mean, you can, right? People can have like these made up fantasy worlds and everything, right? Some people do go crazy as well. So, granted all of that, but in general, like the perception is an aspect of reality. In the case of unfairness, the perception of the perception of unfairness can be created by something which is, say, someone getting a promotion they shouldn't have, someone getting a raise they shouldn't have. Let's say that there's two kids and the mom like spoils one but not the other. There's many different instances of that, and that's going to trigger the perception of unfairness. But it's not like that unfairness thing is something out in the world. It's always a perception because it's a high level concept.
Well, right, but that's my point. My point is that if we're going to have a discussion about what constitutes a cube, right? My perception of a cube might be different, but you can show me scientifically what a cube is, right? But not everything has objective answers. So a high level concept that does not have a scientific answer, the only thing that matters is perception, because you can never point to a reality that is definitive or finite, which means that if I have a perception of unfairness, no matter what caused it, no finite information that you tell me is going to change my perception of unfairness. The only way that I'm going to change my opinion is if you show me a perception of fairness.
Yeah, because that's the way to affect it, right? I mean, that's the only way you can affect it.
Yes, but the fairness doesn't have to be reality, right? You might take an action or show me an instance that isn't in any way related to my original perception of unfairness. But if in my own perception it restores equity, then it could make me happy. But it might not be reality. And it could be manifested just as a response to my perception of unfairness, which, had it never existed, would not have prompted the response.
Right. So they don't have to be related. I agree with that. But, if they're not, if, like, let's say a person has this perception which is unbounded, we call that person a jerk or crazy or they're delusional, right? I mean, the perception doesn't have to necessarily be in congruence with reality, but you would assume that someone who is reasonable, logical, rational, or who at least wants to be somewhat virtuous, when they're presented information which is contrary to that, and that information, say, proves a point, and that based off these facts or the sense data that this perception would be generated, then you would assume that should be the case. If it's not the case, we can't. It's just what happens, right? Sometimes, no matter how wrong a person is, they're going to be convinced they're right. Like, there's people who we used to work with at a previous job, who they think the bank was cheating them out of money or time or resources for whatever reason, and they were clearly in the wrong. Like, they did something that was bad, or they did something that was messed up, right? but they have the perception that's our fault. And we could give them the facts, and they're never going to change their point of view. But it doesn't mean that they're not. It doesn't mean they're right about that.
No, you're right. They're wrong. But let's say that person who, in that example, let's say that you gave that person what they wanted. That person, there's actually one example that I'm thinking of where somebody said that the best way that the bank could make it right for having cheated them would be to give them a 3% rate on a CD. And obviously that's not a rate that we offered at the time. But let's say we gave them that rate and we said, you know what? You're right. That would restore equity. But that's not reality, because it's not fair, for one thing, because that customer gets something that other people don't get just because they demanded it. And second, it's not reality because it's not what the bank offers, and it's not a typical response to that situation. But if we did it, that person's perception might be that we are now fair, right? And they previously felt cheated. So our action that we took was not based on reality. It was based on changing the perception of unfairness. So when you're talking about high-level concepts, you might present information, but that information is presented not for the purpose of altering reality, but for the purpose of altering perception. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, this just kind of goes to the Cartesian demon, right? I mean, people can have improper perceptions, and you can modify those perceptions, which are, say, delineated from reality, right? They don't have to be connected. And I think a lot of cases in the example that you gave, a lot of times people have ulterior motives, like,
oh yeah,
they play themselves, right? Because there's this thing with human nature where someone who is really good at lying is usually not going to be aware they're lying. Like, their brain comes up with these ideas and disconnects from itself to kind of make the lie convincing to the outside person. So there's that kind of disconnect there. So, people make up these crazy stories in their head about how they're right and how things happen that never actually happened, and so on and so forth. So they have that perception, and I don't doubt they don't have that perception, but it's not actually congruent in reality. And you can also play into the perception, right? And that's what happens a lot of times with customer service. Like, you will give people things they don't deserve just to make them happy, and ultimately the calculated decision sometimes is, I want to stop dealing with this person. Let's just get them to shut up and get on their way, because it's not that they're right or wrong. It's just don't just stop. But the other thing is also there's a business decision there, because let's say a company makes money off you. So it's like where we're currently, the company makes money off the customers, right? It's important to keep those customers because they're making, say, $60 to $200 a month off this person. Not full profit, but that's how much you're getting charged. And that customer staying with us and, say, maybe getting a month or two off service, they're making more money off this customer in the long run as opposed to in the short run. So maybe giving into these, say, ludicrous demands based off improper perceptions is definitely feeding into this false reality, but it doesn't mean that there's not a false reality there. And also there's awareness that that's, their reality doesn't actually exist, but, we're just going to placate to get money from you.
Yeah. So in that situation, the reality is the customer is probably wrong, and that what the action that you're taking is actually not fair, but the customer perceives that it's fair based on what they perceived in the first place, which is why they called in, because there was some perception of unfairness or inequity. And the solution in their mind restores that equity. Although the reality from what the company might say or any objective reality might say that they're not entitled to that. But it doesn't actually matter. You see? So when you're dealing, just to summarize, when you're dealing with scientific information, it's one thing if somebody disagrees with something that can be scientifically proven, right? Because you can present facts, people can choose to ignore them, but that's a little different. When you're making a decision that involves high-level concepts, then it's more important to consider the audience's perception of your actions than it is the reality, because there is no objective data that you can show. Once your audience decides that you're not credible based on some perception, it's very difficult to bring them back around in situations where high-level concepts are important, right? I mean, you can...
It's not that it's not possible. It's just that some people it's impossible with, right? I mean, it's not that it's necessarily true. It's just that it's true in some cases. I don't think there's a universal there, but I also don't think it's it's like I said, the standard for just say society in general is that there should be some congruence between reality, the facts of what happened, and say what actually happened. And there's those facts which are discussed and determined, and then these high level concepts, those are hard to often do, and sometimes people are incongruent. Some people have those issues. It doesn't mean that things ought not be that way or things aren't that way. I mean, they don't have to be, right? So there's nothing that necessitates it, because perception and reality, although they intertwine, perception is a mental construct. It's not nothing that actually exists out there. It's just how the brain, say, constructs this reality. But I wouldn't say that you just throw the idea that reality doesn't matter like out completely, because I don't think that's necessary to anything. Like it's true that it doesn't matter in certain circumstances, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't matter, or it doesn't matter in most cases.
I think that you should consider reality, but you also have to decide whether perception is going to outweigh it. Because again, it depends on what kind of argument you're making. This is why you see a lot of CEOs step down from their positions, because there's two aspects to that. The first one is the company doesn't want to fire the CEO because then the company looks incompetent, and the perception of the company's incompetence is more important than the reality that the CEO did something worth firing. So you always see the CEOs quit, and they don't give the real reason why they're quitting. Because again, the perception of the public is more important, and the company wants to continue to maintain a good reputation and keep their customers. So the reality doesn't matter. The CEO might have done something disgusting, might have done something criminal even, right? But the reality is a lot of us have made mistakes. Employees at lower levels make mistakes all the time. But when you get to the level of a CEO, making mistakes is a lot more significant. But we don't talk about the mistakes because the perception of society is that if you are a CEO, that you are some type of, some type of deity, and you shouldn't make mistakes, right? They're criticized heavily. And I'm not saying people worship CEOs, but I'm saying that when a CEO makes a mistake, it's far more significant in terms of public perception than when an employee makes a mistake. And that's why they don't fire them.
Right. Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. And the perception definitely does matter. And part of the reason why it matters is because obtaining or understanding or kind of even having some sort of window into the facts of that case, it's really, really difficult. Like it's number one, difficult to follow. If you go into like any sort of crazy political scandal, or let's just say even talk about something like with the housing crisis back in 2008. Like there's so many documentaries on that, so many thoughts, so many people giving out information about it, about what actually happened. And a lot of people have similar narratives, but other people have different narratives. There's different interpretations of the same facts. And there's also just different facts being focused upon. Like some people will talk about like Bear Stearns or, those other things, but other people focus on all these all other metrics. And so the facts that actually interplay into that are kind of, ubiquitous, or they're kind of hard to actually determine. So it's, for me, in that level, it's not that the concept is, say difficult. It's more like it's hard to disprove, or it's hard to gain facts about that case. Or like the window into reality is very, very difficult. And even if you were to have all those facts, the ability to perceive those facts with any sort of due diligence or kind of like full clarity is very, very difficult for the average person to do. So instead of say, like someone might have to spend full-time working hours for about a month to understand all the facts, right? Who's an investigator. The fact,
Right.
the ability for the public to understand any of that and kind of have any accurate perception, they can't perceive these facts in a way, so just ignore it because that there's no easy way out of this. You're not going to educate the whole public to understanding all the details of this facts, especially when there's going to be other facts that are going to come out that are going to shape their perception too.
Right. And then on top of that, you have people's own personal biases and agendas. So, people interpret facts in different ways. Again, that goes back to perception. You have something that seems like an objective fact, and people interpret it different ways. So it is just easier to say, you know what, you should resign and give a different reason. So just to summarize, I do think I agree with you that reality matters, but sometimes perception is more important. And so when you're weighing the facts in any given situation, particularly when you have to make decisions that impact groups of people, or if you're somebody who's in the public eye and is likely to be judged, you, in my opinion, would first have to consider the reality, but before making a decision, you then have to pass that through the filter of public perception.
I don't disagree with you either, though, but I feel like you're just going a little bit too far in focusing on the perception. Because to me, like, the perception is like a portion of reality, right? So you have reality, which is kind of like the foundation of the house, and then perception is built on top of it. And now the foundation can go off on these, or the actual house can actually go off in these all different directions and kind of be ecologically made and everything. So it doesn't have to like correspond, but there's this kind of firm foundation everything's built on, and that's kind of the basis point that you kind of connect everything to. One thing I'll cover as well is, I do think that you don't always need to argue the facts of reality to, sometimes you just argue the facts of perception, right? So, for instance, yesterday I got some blood work done, and the nurse who was doing the thing was kind of snippy and snide. I mean, she was trying to be nice, right? So I could see she was trying to be nice, but she was like just being a little bit short, and she like say, so this is what she did. She like put her what do you call it, the tourniquet around my arm, and then she started drawing the blood, and she told me to make a fist. Okay, so I make the fist, all right, and then release the fist, and then so I released the fist, and a couple of seconds like, oh, I told you to make the fist and say to release it. Now she said to release it, right? But she just was not really paying attention. I get it. She was overworked. She's it seemed like she's the only one working there. There's a lot of different things to that, right? But she had the internal perception that she told me not to release the fist. Now I could argue with her, saying, "Oh, like, no, actually, you told me to do it. You're not being, your internal reality is not, say, synergistic with the actual reality." I could go into that, but instead, what I said is, "Oh, sorry, I'm kind of tired. I just woke up." Right. So I gave her the out, number one, but also I just kind of said, that, I wasn't being, say, disobeying. I was just kind of like, just tired, not really paying attention. So, placation there, right? Because there's not a really, I could argue with her about the facts reality there, but there's not a real reason to. I mean, just kind of go
right, because perception is going to outweigh reality. So you can give her objective facts all you want, but if she believes one thing and she doesn't believe that you're a credible source, then there'd be no reason for her to believe you. And I know that's not your reasoning. I'm sure that for you, it's just that I know that you're a very logical person like me, and so what likely went through your mind there is that there is less to gain from arguing than there is to, I mean, like, what would be the net outcome for you by debating that, right?
Also, it's like my perception versus her perception, right?
Right.
She's just gonna tell me, like, she might say, "Oh, like," she might placate me, right? She's like, "Oh, yeah, sorry, I must have misspoke her there," or something like that. She might just kind of back off a little bit, or she might say, "No, I'm wrong. I told you to release your hand. I told you to, make a fist, and you didn't." Right? She might just say my perception's wrong. What am I gonna do there? Like, there's no win if she tells me my perception's wrong.
That's another important distinction too, is that when you have two different perceptions that may be based on high level concepts, then how do you objectively persuade one or the other person, right? You can't necessarily persuade using reality because, again, there's no objective reality to high level concepts. So what you do,
I mean, you could, though, if it was like something like you had video evidence, or you had something where say this is unfair, and then there's something there which actually proves your point. You could provide that.
but there won't always be. Like,
No.
One great example is the existence of God. If you have one person that says that God exists and one person says that God doesn't exist, right? You both have a different perception of creationism. Maybe one person thinks that it's, you get what I'm saying, right? But then how do you prove or disprove each other's positions? And you might say science, right? But a more compelling argument, if you're on the side of religion, rather than citing the Bible, because the other person doesn't believe in the same religion, right? So that's not a good argument, because for you that's reality, but it's not reality for the other person. So you have to appeal to their perception. So a better argument would be, well, what if God created organisms capable of evolving, right? And because then you're incorporating that person's perception that there's some scientific progression of mankind. And that's much more difficult for that person to argue. And it's possible that maybe you find some middle ground there, right? But by simply arguing each other's perception of reality, you're never going to change it. So my core point, going back everything I've said before, is that when you're making arguments about high-level concepts, it's more important to appeal to the audience's perception, because then you're more likely to draw them closer to this sort of symbiotic reality that everybody can see together.
Right, right. You kind of threw me off with that whole God point at first, because like, where is Patrick going with this? This is a little bit concerning. Like, we're going to left field. But okay, I get you there, because there's maybe not the facts that are like you can't have all the facts, or maybe you can, but you know there's a big contention whether you can have all the facts to even make that determination.
The facts are in dispute,
right? And also, what facts are relevant are in dispute, right? Because you could say that. You know, even if, say, humanity or, say, just nature evolved in a certain way, some people would say that's irrelevant to the fact whether God exists or not. You know, this is just something separate. Some people might say it is relevant. Some people might say this fact existence at all is relevant to the fact whether God exists or not. And then other people would argue against that. And there's just so many different facts that are in dispute there. And another point you bring up is that in order to, it's more like an argumentation sort of side, which is that in order to get someone to change their opinion or, say, perception of reality, is you often have to be aware of their perception themselves, right? And a part of that is just like their current understanding of how things work, because you could present, you know, just your understanding, but you have to present understanding in a way that's going to like actually mesh with their brain. I think the kind of example there, or like a good analogy, is like I could explain something to you in French, and that thing could be completely fluent. You know, it could make sense in French, but if I'm speaking French to you, someone who doesn't speak French, like, it doesn't matter what I'm saying. It doesn't matter. Someone else might understand it completely because they have that, you know, valid frame of reference. You don't have that frame of reference. So me explaining something to you in French is just kind of stupid. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And on a cultural level, something that you've brought up in a previous podcast, you know, the different appeals for argumentation, right? This is important too, because if you know someone's perception, which is often culturally influenced, then you know what kind of appeals are going to work better for them, right? So there might be some people where you could make an appeal to authority, right? Maybe somebody who's in the military that has a lot of experience with that kind of thing, they might be more willing to be persuaded with appeals to authority. There might be people who are a little bit more scientific, and appeal to experts might be more important, or, you know, citing of statistics. There might be people who are just very free-spirited and philosophical, and so maybe some appeal to higher reasoning might make more sense to them. But the fact that argumentation approach changes depending on the person, but not necessarily the subject, I think is a very strong argument for the strength of perception.
Right, right. Well, I think we'll probably end this one pretty soon here, but yeah, but like,
Yeah.
like, because we could talk another hour about this, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, yeah.
But one aspect there is that some people just have biases in what perceptions they trust or, say, really internalize. So there's that common saying, like, you know, I'll see it, or I believe it when I see it, right? Some people are more biased towards, say, a visual perception, right? Like, you can explain something to them verbally, and that thing might be logical, right? You might say A is B, B is C, therefore A is C, right? So there's a valid logical thing. For me, that works, because I'm like, my general perceptual leanings are more internal and more logic and kind of say semantical based, right? I mean, there's some more stuff to it, but you know, that's kind of what my internal kind of leanings are, more auditory based. A lot of people, they're more, say, visually based. So you might tell them 100 times, you know, like, that's not possible because X, Y, Z. You give them all these different reasons, and they're like, what are you even talking about? Or they might kind of get, you're saying, like, I get what you're saying, but, you know, I don't really believe it. And then you show them, you know, let's say you can bring them to the site, or you can kind of show it visually, and like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, I get you now. So a lot of times the perception is kind of linked to like a certain like sometimes the perception is more just like this stimuli that's kind of giving it, be it visual, auditory, spatial. Sometimes spatial perception is important, maybe
Okay.
perceptions of sensation, but just like sometimes it's just about finding that right kind of avenue.
Okay. So, yeah, I know we have to wrap this up, but just to let's kind of summarize here. So for me, I think to answer the original question, does reality matter? Okay. Yes, it matters. But I think that it matters depending on the scope of the argument and the perception of the audience. I think that would be the best way to summarize my perspective. What about you?
I think we're in agreement there because I think the more kind of focused in and more, say, low level concept base you get, the more reality matters. And the more high level you get, the less it matters. Or not the less it matters, but the harder it is to affect perception, right? Like perception on, say, a low level basis of like, is that a screw over there or is that like a rectangle? That's super easy to affect or kind of change. Whereas, say high level concepts like justice or injustice or, whether someone's a good person, those are super hard to affect. And a lot of times they are discongruent reality. So it maybe doesn't matter less, but maybe it's less incongruent and less hard to change or it's hard to affect.
Yeah, I'm really glad we talked about this because I think that ultimately, it's technically the same no matter what. That reality and perception are actually equal in importance, but it's like you're saying that there's a scale of complexity, and when you reach a certain level of complexity, it becomes more difficult to move a person's perception, and therefore you have to rely less on factual data.
Hmm.
So that I think that's really the answer.
Yeah, yeah. I think we just cured cancer.
Yeah.
Let's pat ourselves on the back.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you like this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future conversations. There will be plenty of them, I'm sure.
Yep, we're hoping to get back a bit more into the groove now that I have my phone and that I have things are getting a little less worse. I mean, Patrick's still wearing his ninja gear because he's ready for a battle, but hopefully we can actually do this in person more because I like the in-person conversations better.
Yeah, me too. I think they just go a lot better.
All right, and you guys have a great day. Definitely subscribe, like the video, like Patrick said, and until next time, hey, have a great day.